All right, what's up, boys? Doing another one of the old question answering things. As always, if you have anything that you would like my opinion on, leave it in the comments of this video, and I will get it to it in the next video. Just about all of the comments in the last one are from one dude, so shout out to that dude. I appreciate the questions because I like doing these and I need questions to do them. Yeah, so getting into it, the first question was how much time should we rest in between accessories, bodybuilding sets? Okay, so he specified that we're talking about like tertiary accessories, meaning like smaller. I wouldn't say isolation because some of them are compounds, but like motions that you're entirely focused on, like a hypertrophic outcome. And I'm going to give you my personal answer, which would be that it does not matter all that much as long as it's standardized. To drive progressive overload, we need good control of our variables for it to be true overload. Because did you really get that much better if you did 5 pounds more but you rested twice as long? You want to control your variables. So as long as we're keeping it consistent, you might find that different exercises lend themselves to different rest times. You might be able to only perform an exercise really well with a sufficient amount of rest, whereas others it doesn't matter as much, such as like triceps. You don't need all that much rest. And I think if we observe at the highest level of hypertrophy, the highest level of hypertrophy being bodybuilding, there are people who achieve a very high level of hypertrophy using very different methods. Some of the stronger guys will do much longer rests. So like James Hollingshead, I'm just gonna guess Hakeem Williams rests a while. Back in the day, like Luke Sando, Dallas McCarver, both I'm going to go out on a limb and guess rested a fair bit. So the guys who are really, really outstandingly strong seem to have rested quite a bit, but there's also people producing significantly comparable outcomes using less weight and less rest times, such as like Jay Cutler did more of like a straight set approach and built a world-class level of hypertrophy using more of a low rest straight set thing. And so I think that what's the commonality between all of those is training intensity, not meaning percentage, but training intensity meaning like difficulty, the number of sets you're doing within a close proximity of failure. And just like the intensity of the training seems to be what matters the most, because there's some guys who perform at the highest level doing a high volume approach like Jay Cutler, and there's some guys who do a very low volume approach like Dorian Yates, right? Working up to like a singular top set in the desired rep range. So what can we take away from that? Either can be done at a high level, so to some degree it's personal preference. As long as you're training really hard and we're keeping them standard, then we should expect to see good outcomes either way. Usually I recommend a little bit shorter rest times, just so that your training sessions don't take excessively long, because presumably your main work took a while if that's your main focus as a power lifter or someone who's more strength oriented. The second question is, how important is it to sleep in a pitch dark room? I heard Stan Efferding talk about it in one of his speeches. Okay, so I think the best attempt at an answer that I can give is if we just assume that people, how well they sleep is on a bell curve, just like everything else is, with the majority of people falling somewhere in the average like quality of sleep. Some people sleeping extremely well, and some people sleeping really shittily. And we also assume that like sensitivity to light affecting sleep falls on a similar bell curve. Then where you're at in the bell curve probably is just going to determine how important it is. It's not going to be like one size fits all. If you feel like you sleep fucking great, you don't have any issues falling asleep, you don't have any issues staying asleep, even in a bright room, clearly it does not matter all that much. You can validate that with like a sleep study or even just like a Fitbit, something to quantify your sleep. But also if you perceive that you're sleeping very well, more than likely you are. Usually when people struggle with their sleep, they're very, very aware of it, right? So I'd say if you fall into that category, doesn't really matter. I wouldn't stress about it. If you fall into the opposite category where you sleep like shit, or you're very sensitive to light and you're up at the crack of dawn the second you see light, yeah, it's probably very important for you, because we know that sleep is very important, and anything that's holding back the quality of your sleep is thus very important. And then for most people, it falls somewhere in the middle. Somewhere in the middle where it justifies trying. There's some downsides to it. It probably makes getting up in the morning a little bit more difficult because you don't have the natural light to help ease you out of REM sleep. But if you're someone who considers your sleep average, I think it's worth a try. I wouldn't say it's super important or necessary, to answer your question though. The next question was, what do you think of auto-regulating volume? Auto-regulating intensity with RPE or RIR seems to be extremely popular, but auto-regulating volume doesn't seem to be that popular. Do you know why? The answer is because it's kind of tricky, right? So if we say like, okay, we're going to work up to a fixed number of reps at a variable intensity, right? So what you're saying is very popular. That's a little bit easier to avoid overshooting than undershooting, whereas it's pretty difficult during a set. I say, okay, squat until you have 3 reps in reserve, right? So we auto-regulate the number of reps rather than the intensity. It's very, very hard to say in the middle of a difficult set a genuine appraisal, because a lot of us will look at videos or use retrospective, asking a friend, thinking about it after the fact to assign a more accurate RPE. So mid-set gets a little bit hard, although that is something I do myself. I'm a fucking nobody, so who cares? But that is something that I like to play around with. And then the other kind of volume regulation that you can do is the number of sets at a fixed weight. And the reason that's not programmed is because the workout can be just a completely different workout depending on how the condition that the person comes in, right? So if I say you're working up to a single at a 7 and you're hitting these back off sets, right? The workout is going to be the same thing. We're presenting basically a similar stimulus that's going to be scaled based on how prepared the person is for the session, right? Whereas if I say between 2 and 6 sets of 5, and they hit 2 sets of 5 instead of 6 sets of 5, those are very different sessions, right? Which isn't innately a bad thing, but it's definitely a little harder to program and predict and work around, right? Which is probably why we don't see it very much. But I do like the idea of like RIR capped AMRAPs, so you can do as many reps as you can until you hit roughly 3 in reserve, 2 in reserve, 1 in reserve. I think those are much more intelligent uses of a rep out style, which is something I've always enjoyed. It's not necessarily the most well thought out training strategy always, but I think that there's significant psychological benefits to it for some people, just the opportunity to train a little harder. Yeah, I would say that would be my thoughts on it. I'm a big fan of RIR capped AMRAPs. It's something I enjoy programming, and it's something I very much enjoy doing, as long as you're honest with yourself and you're a little bit more of an advanced lifter, so that you're basing it off of correct reps in reserve, not true reps in reserve, right? Because who cares how many good mornings you could squeak out with your squat weight? What you want to know is how many more squats you could do. So, there's a time and a place for it, in my opinion. The next question was, does taking a week off of the gym give the same benefits as a regular deload, reducing volume and intensity for a week? I'm assuming you're still active in the sense of walking, eating at caloric maintenance or a slight surplus. Okay, so that's a really good question. We're going to decay our fatigue, right? So if we're looking at that strength recovery SRA curve, our fatigue is going down, so we're kind of accomplishing the goals of a deload, but more than likely we're going to see 2 things. If you're a smaller natural lifter, you very well might see some level of detraining effect during that week, and that's the reason we come into the gym and we do less volume and less intensity during a deload, but we don't do nothing, right? Is we want to do little enough that we can decay our fatigue, but enough that we can stave off a detraining effect, right? And then the other thing, other than strength, that could detrain is your technique. That's just another thing. Is more than likely when you come back off of a full week off, your technique is going to feel fairly clunky, right? Because we had some level of physical detraining potentially, and more than likely we had some level of technical detraining, and that's why that's kind of a worse option than a true traditional deload. Yeah. The next question: do you take a break from electronics sometime prior to sleep? That's a good question. The answer is I absolutely should. Because my job is being an online coach, that is not something that I'm able to do more often than not. My response times aren't spectacular, but I do try to get back to every single person that messages me or texts me during the day that same day. So oftentimes I'll make it to the end of the day and I'll have a bunch of questions and I will have to work through those because that is my job. And that is totally okay, but it's probably not best practice for a pure performance perspective. Might have to do spreadsheets before bed, but I do try to avoid leisure phone time before bed. So let's say I get all my work done at 8:30. I'm going to bed at whatever 9:30. I'll try to find a way to entertain myself that doesn't involve a screen, and if I am using a screen, maybe there's merit to switching it to night mode or using those yellow tinted glasses that filter blue light because I think it's specifically blue light that inhibits melatonin production in your head. So maybe we could get some of those benefits, especially if you're someone who's going to be forced to look at a screen before going to bed. You can try to take steps to mitigate that, such as blue light filtering glasses. Yeah, that'd be my attempt at an answer. And then the final question was, what are your thoughts on Evan Cardone? I don't know how to say his last name. I'm just going to say Cardone. The guy who sticks his tongue out at the top of his deadlift. Many people say his form is horrible. The question is how he hasn't gotten injured yet. Since you're a powerlifting coach, I'd love to hear what you think about his form. Is it really as bad as dangerous as a lot of people think? Okay, so my best summation would be he's pretty damn strong. Okay, so when you're looking at his technique, right, is it dangerous? I think most of the scientific literature right now is kind of indicating that there is no innately dangerous positions or techniques, only inadequate load selection, right? So we're doing loads that our tissue is not prepared for, right? So every tissue in the human body has like a capacity. Excuse me. Everything has a capacity, and injuries are only going to occur when we exceed that capacity, right? And there's day-to-day variables that can, alter the capacity, right? So if I come in severely dehydrated to a training session, more than likely, that loading capacity of my muscles is decreased. So a load that might not injure me normally might injure me that day, right? But that being said, load tolerance is something that can be built up. Most of the tissues in the human body are capable of basically strengthening, right? So we know bones can increase in density, tendons can increase in density, and muscles can increase in strength. And those are most of the things that are relevant to a lift, right? So we know that we're capable of adaptation on all fronts. So hypothetically, someone could build up plenty of strength to pick up weight in what most people are like, oh, that's Snap City. The reason it's Snap City for most people is because their strength has been built up in a specific position, and strength is somewhat dependent on the joint angle, right? So the real reason they got hurt is because they built all this strength in one position, their form breaks down, and they enter a different position where they don't have sufficient strength, and they exceed the tissue loading capacity in that position, right? That's why standardizing your form to some degree is probably important, so that we're not entering completely different positions where we don't have strength. But if someone like Evan did all of their deadlifts from this, traditionally bad position, then more than likely their injury risk is manageable. If we look at some of like the famous round back deadlifters, like Konstantin Konstantinov's, Pete Rubish, and we'll just go with those two, right? And then we'll throw Evan in that mix. Not that I think he deserves to be in that list yet, right? If you look at Konstantin Konstantinov, never hurt his back deadlifting. He built up a lot of very position-specific strength, and he never hurt himself, right? He only hurt his back when he was squatting and he was doing like MMA training, right? So motions that he hadn't built up as much tolerance to. Same thing with Pete Rubish. Pete Rubish's back injury came about from squatting, not from deadlifting, because he did have that deadlift-specific strength, even in that position that a lot of people might say is bad, right? So we know from an injury risk perspective that as long as you're preparing well, it's probably okay. That being said, there's two elements to form, right? So you have this perceived injury risk component, but there's also mechanical efficiency, right? And when you round your back, you're making yourself mechanically more advantageous off the floor, and then making the lockout significantly harder, because not only do you have to get your hips all the way through, there's a lot of unrounding you have to do of your back. And if you watch most of Evan's heaviest training pulls, he's not locking them out. Those are shy lockouts. I used to do shy lockouts. I know exactly what they look like. I know what it looks like to play off a shy lockout, to film from the front, pretend you got your shoulders back and just hyperextend through your low back. I'm very familiar with that. I know what I'm looking at. That is not a comp legal pull, right? So if we're talking, yeah, that's probably mechanically reasonably efficient to do what he's doing, but it's not necessarily mechanically efficient to do a competition standard pull. But clearly that's not something he's concerned with right now, or he wouldn't be pulling in straps exclusively, he wouldn't be pulling on pound plates exclusively. I'd imagine he's not a dumb guy. I'm sure a lot of what he does is an act. I'm sure that he knows, okay, well, I'm getting some amount of weight out of my straps, I'm getting some amount of weight out of my pound plates, and a lot of people are watching my shit, right? That's affording him some level of opportunity, and he's choosing to basically Instagram lift, which is fine. people don't really make much money off of powerlifting. There's more money to be made off of Instagram lifting, as unfortunate as that is. So, tailoring your lifts to what's going to get you the most views rather than what's going to prepare you most for the competition setting is something that he's choosing to do. Whereas, if he was prepping for a competition style pull without his straps on and he was pulling on kilos, so he had that less margin of error and was held to a higher standard of locking out, I'm sure that you could argue that his form definitely would be more efficient if he knew how to use his lats at all. I don't know. I would say that I have no gripe with the guy. I think a lot of people dislike him for no reason. I think that it's mostly a character anyway, and I wouldn't recommend deadlifting like that. But that being said, he's not running this huge risk of injury. He's not going to shorten his fucking lifespan like a lot of people say. I just think it's not necessarily the best way to go about achieving the best competition results you can. Might be a really good way to get a big Instagram pull, though. Thank you for the questions, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the video. And as always, if you have anything you would like my opinion on, put it in the comments of this video.